Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about stalking. My name is Emilie Mitchell, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Trisha Whitmire. Trisha currently works as an Assistant Director in Equal Opportunity at Valencia College and responds to allegations of discrimination, harassment, and related misconduct, including interpersonal violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and facilitates trainings for faculty, staff, and students on these topics. She recently graduated from the University of Central Florida with a Ph.D. in Sociology and a focus on crime and deviant behavior. Trisha, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And I also have Orialis Sosa. Orialis is a bilingual crisis counselor and victim advocate at VSC, currently pursuing her license in clinical mental health counseling in the state of Florida. Orialis has developed and implemented a DBT skills group at VSC to help victims, survivors with mindfulness and emotion regulation skills. She uses a trauma-focused lens and is passionate about fostering growth and healing through self-reflection, self-forgiveness, and self-acceptance. Thank you as well for returning, Orialis, because you did our Spanish podcast, but thanks for being here too.
Thanks so much, Emilie. I'm really excited too.
So as a brief introduction, on this podcast, we discuss topics that are not talked about as much as they should. And I think stalking is no different. As a community, we don't really think about stalking, but according to the National Center for Victims of Crime, 1,006,970 women and 370,000 men are stalked annually in the United States. And as always, those are just reported numbers. So stalking is such a huge issue that affects many people every year. So what we are looking to explore in this episode is what exactly is stalking, what is cyberstalking, and what can we do to help victims and survivors of stalking. So with that in mind, I wanted to first talk to you, Trisha. Congratulations first and foremost on receiving your PhD. With that, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Valencia and your recent dissertation?
Absolutely. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for the congratulations on the PhD. I'm really excited to finally be done with that. So, like you said in the intro, with Valencia, we focus mainly on the discrimination, harassment, related misconduct policy. So when we receive allegations that somebody has engaged in one of these behaviors, then we just respond to them in the most appropriate way. So sometimes we get reports and the other person isn't in any way affiliated with the college. So with those, we're kind of limited on what we can do because we can't do anything to the person who's alleged to have done the behavior. We don't have any control over someone who's not affiliated with the college. So in those instances, what we're really focused on is how to support the person who's reporting. So it could be For example, maybe they are having trouble focusing on their classwork because they've experienced some sort of trauma. And so it might be us working with their faculty member to see if they can get extensions, or even dropping the class for them if they don't feel like they can continue right now. And then just providing them with some resources, mainly to you guys, to be able to get them the assistance that they need to kind of work through it. And then in the cases where both parties are affiliated with the college, it could progress to a full investigation into the allegations to see if the person maybe violated our policy, and then if there's any sort of repercussions for that. So do they still need to be a student at the college is what we're really looking at. Have they done something that's so egregious that we don't feel that it's safe to have them as part of our college community anymore? And then, of course, we do the trainings kind of throughout the campuses as well. We're kind of in a unique position where we really interact pretty evenly with faculty, staff, and students. So we have kind of both the student-facing position and the employee-facing position. So we have kind of a unique opportunity to be able to offer training to everybody on the campuses. And then for my dissertation, decided, I guess I could talk a little bit about why I decided to do that. So before I came to Valencia, one of my previous roles was I actually worked at a local domestic violence shelter. I was there for 5 years, so I saw a lot of different cases, a lot of things come up. And I specifically remember one situation where a survivor had gotten a no contact order through the prosecutor's office, and the person was still contacting her, was still making phone calls and leaving messages and things like that. And when she was contacting the prosecutor saying, hey, this person's violating the no contact order, the prosecutor told her, we need you to answer the phone. And we said, what do you mean she needs to answer the phone? And they said, well, we need you to verify the voice. Otherwise, we don't have a way of proving that it's that person, because they can say, oh, my friend grabbed my phone and thought it would be funny to call you, or, oh, I butt dialed you by accident. So we need you to pick up the phone and verify the voice. Fast forward to later, I was teaching at UCF, and I had a student who had a sibling who was being stalked. And she was telling me, my sister has an ex who's stalking her, and she picks up the phone and she, says, stop calling me, and then hangs up. And when she reported to law enforcement, they said, well, clearly you're not very afraid of this person because you keep answering the phone. And I was just blown away by the conflicting responses that were given, and decided that that was something I really wanted to look at. How do law enforcement and prosecutors view these sorts of cases, and do they take them seriously, and what do they do about them when they do receive them? So that was kind of what led me to want to look at stalking, in particular cyber stalking, a little bit more in depth.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing all of that. I can definitely see the issue of the conflicting responses. That's very confusing. And I think your dissertation kind of goes into looking at those reports, right? And seeing what responses were made and how that has, how that's affected the cases. Is that right?
Yeah, so what I did was I had police reports pulled from 3 different counties for a 3-year period and asked for all of their stalking reports. I am sure that these 3 counties do not ever want to hear my name again, because I'm sure their records departments are just really tired of me right now. But in total, I got 888 police reports from Orange, Seminole, and Brevard counties to be able to kind of review and look through them. So I was able to track everything in the reports. So I was looking at demographics, the different methods that were used. So were they using phone calls, text messages? Was it in person? Was it some sort of combination of both? What was the relationship between the victim and the offender? What sort of action did the victim take to prevent anything? What was law enforcement's response? Did they make an arrest? Were there charges filed? Did the case go to trial? Was there a guilty verdict? Like I kind of followed the cases from beginning to end to see what happened with them and how far did they go.
Awesome. Yeah. So first off, thanks for doing all that work. And I'm sure we'll be getting more into exactly what you found. But I did want to ask you, Orialis, as an advocate at the Victim Service Center, just wanted to start off, what is stalking, and what are some red flags or signs of stalking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the definition for stalking can be a little bit vague. So I think that might make it a more difficult, for people to recognize that really that's what they're experiencing. Really, it can be defined as, a pattern of unwanted behavior and communication that's targeting a specific person, and it's causing that person to feel distressed or fearful. Some of the indicators that a person, some of the red flags that somebody might want to be looking out for may be one, receiving, persistent phone calls, like Trisha was saying. Even if you're telling the person, stop making contact, I don't want to talk to you anymore, the person might keep going. Receiving persistent messages, through social media, having them constantly trying to reach out to your family members, sending letters, just trying to contact you persistently. Constantly maybe calling. This may also be even if you're in a relationship with the person, because we know that there is a correlation between intimate partner violence and stalking as well. So calling constantly throughout the day, asking where are you at, what are you doing, who are you with, always wanting to keep tabs on you. I think also if you're noticing that person, showing up unannounced, they may be waiting outside of your workplace, it's just this kind of threatening presence where you're starting to see them everywhere that you go. Um, they may also be doing threats to your family or towards your friends, towards your property, towards your, pets. It's really about having that power control over you. So anything that, again, may put you in a situation where you feel threatened and unsafe. Sometimes they may also be using manipulative behavior. So they may threaten to attempt suicide. They may threaten to, hurt somebody else in order to get a response from you. I think also, sometimes they may create fake social media accounts, pretending to be you, trying to reach out to your family and friends. If it's somebody you're in a relationship with, they may be wanting to check your phone constantly, keeping tabs on you on your location, using different tracking apps. They may also be sending unwanted gifts, like these big kind of, gifts. And I think that one's a big one too, because some of these behaviors, at the beginning can be sort of like, oh, these are romantic gestures, oh, they showed up at my job, oh, they sent me this big, lavish gift. And, again, it can be romanticized, but it can also potentially be, a red flag. So I think ultimately, really trusting your gut. If you're starting to feel, afraid, if you're starting to feel threatened, if you notice that you're starting to change your own behavior, like you're trying to avoid the places that you used to go because, you see this person everywhere. I think really just trusting your gut in that situation. And that may be an indicator that, it may be important to reach out to like a victim advocate, or the police department if possible.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that information. Really good information about what stalking is. When you're talking, Orialis, the word that's coming up in my mind is boundaries. Because you're right. I think a lot of it is romanticized of, oh, they showed up at my work, how sweet. And I think that threatening presence that you're talking about, crossing those boundaries and the persistence of it too, definitely is what starts making it a stalking, like a red flag, that kind of thing. Trisha, back to your research. I wanted to ask, out of all the things that you discovered, what surprised you the most?
So it was really interesting reading some of these reports and kind of following them along to see what happened, because I was really frequently surprised about which cases made it all the way through this criminal justice system and which ones didn't. There were some that I just remember kind of scratching my head at and thinking, wow, you guys really pursued this one, huh? That's the one you chose to go with? There was, one in particular that involved a neighbor who put dog excrement in his neighbor's driveway 3 times, and they decided to prosecute him and went all the way. And he was found guilty of stalking. I was mind blown with some of these. And then another where somebody had put a single negative review on somebody's Facebook business page, and they were also taken kind of throughout the entire process. And then I see other ones where there's threats of violence, or they're sending pictures of their guns and say, maybe not directly saying I'm going to kill you, but they're implying it through, the words that they're saying and the pictures that they're sending. And then those didn't go anywhere and they just kind of stopped there. One of the things that I noticed too when I was looking, and I'd look in the clerk of court site to see, what happened with this case, it was pretty common for me to see some of the same names pop up repeatedly. So it might be the same offender and the same victim again, but the behavior had escalated. So in the cases where they didn't pursue it when it was stalking, it was common that they'd kind of progress to, breaking and entering or to battery. And that's when they were taken seriously. So that was really shocking to kind of see that there was this inconsistency with how they were handled, which ones were, really pursued. Overall, it just kind of seemed that the cases that were pushed forward were the ones that they really felt like they could win. So it wasn't so much these are the ones that are the most dangerous, or these are the ones that pose the greatest harm to the victim, but these are the ones that when we take it to court, we know that we can win them. So we're going to pursue those because, we want to win, and that's important.
Wow. Yeah, it makes me kind of think of what Orialis was saying earlier, where I think stalking is sometimes, probably because we don't talk about it enough, hard to identify, hard to know when is it stalking.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so much of the statute definition of stalking relies on how the victim kind of felt, in that, and you can't really assume how somebody's going to feel about anything. So something that may be totally normal to me could terrify you. And so that needs to be taken into account, and it doesn't seem like it always was. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, and that actually leads to my next question for you, Orialis. As an advocate and crisis counselor for the VSC, you work with many victims of different kinds of crimes. So with that being said, what are some impacts that stalking can have on a person?
Right. I mean, with stalking, I really kind of see it similar to, an abusive relationship where it's not just one incident that's happening. It's, this chronic traumatic stress, because it can go on. I mean, it can go on for weeks, for months. There's reports of things like this going on for years. So victims are really throughout that time living in a state of terror, where you don't know. Every day is kind of unpredictable. You don't know when things are going to escalate, or, your safety is really just at jeopardy. So even when the person has not, physically hurt you, or, it hasn't escalated to a point where threats have been made, there is still that potential, and it still should be taken seriously, because the emotional toll that it can take on somebody is really debilitating. It's not uncommon for survivors to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, things like high anxiety or depression or insomnia. Many folks throughout that process, they come to feel like it's just never going to end. They don't feel protected, even just like how Trisha is saying, all of these reports are made, and unfortunately, a lot of times they may not end up in prosecution. So that can lead, for folks to feel isolated, to feel frustrated that, there's nobody out there that, can protect them, and really just feeling super hopeless. Folks may also, it changes your whole life. They may change what they do. They may stop going to the places they used to go. They may have difficulty trusting people. So again, you're losing power, you're losing control over your life, and kind of, losing yourself and the things that you enjoy, doing. And I think it's really important too, because our whole body experiences trauma. So when someone's going through this where we don't feel safe, your body's nervous system is going to be overly activated. Your body's going to be pumping out stress hormones all day, right? Because you don't know what's the next thing that's going to happen. Am I going to see them when I go outside? Am I going to be safe today? So unfortunately, that, constant adrenaline, constant stress response can become dysregulated. And, really, we're not meant to sustain those chronic levels of stress. So even after, after the stalking has stopped, or maybe a year has gone by, I think that's really the dangerous part, is that your body's still reactive. Your body may still feel as if you're unsafe and you don't know what's going to happen. So I think just, again, those emotional tolls, even if it hasn't reached that level of the physical or the threats, just the emotional impacts that it can have, not just for that moment, but for years to come, of starting to see the world through that fear-based lens of not knowing who you can trust and, not knowing that you're safe and protected.
That's a really good point too, where it's constant fear because you don't know where they're going to be. You don't know where they are or at home too. If they know where you live, that kind of thing, you can't even be comfortable in your own home.
Right.
So really important stuff to bring up when we talk about, the effects that stalking can have on victims. So thank you so much for sharing that. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, Trisha, in this digital age, especially right now, I think we're constantly online connecting with people that way. I think, cyber stalking is really important to bring up, and I know that you wanted to talk about that. So can you tell us a little bit about, cyber stalking, and do you think cyber stalking is more common, or what have you found with your research?
Yeah, so there's just so much technology now. It's pretty much impossible to not be involved in it some way or another, whether you have phone or Skype or social media, it's everywhere. And it just makes it, in some ways it's great because we're able to connect with people that we usually wouldn't be able to. We can, be able to talk with family and see them and, catch up with people on social media that you haven't talked to in years and be able to know what they're doing and how they're doing and how their families are. But at the same time, it also means you can't really escape somebody either because there's always some way to be able to connect. There's always a phone number that can be found or an email address or a social media account. And unless you are disconnecting from all of it, you can't really get away from somebody if they're trying to find you. There's just so many tools, there's all these apps that are being created, and a lot of them, for the most part, they're well intended when they're created, at least from what it seems. There's a lot of different apps that are created that are marketed towards parents. So use this, put this on your child's phone so that you can tell what they're doing and you can make sure they're safe. You can make sure that they're not talking to strangers on the internet. You can make sure that they're not going someplace that they're not supposed to. But what can end up happening is that somebody who is a stalker can use these sorts of apps for tracking somebody that they were previously dating, or a current partner, and be able to know exactly what they're doing, and what they're saying, and they won't even know that it's happening. Some of these apps run in the background on your phone and you don't even see it listed, and you would have no idea that it's there if it wasn't for the fact that maybe they were popping up places or changing things on your phone if they know your password and they're changing it. So while there's technology for good, sometimes it's being used for evil. I know that we've all probably received, phone calls from numbers that are very similar to our own. I get phone calls pretty much every day where the first 6 digits match mine. And the goal, I think, of these, it's most likely, spammers. They're trying to get you to answer because you're more likely to answer if it's a number that looks like it's coming from your area. But the apps to use that, there's plenty of spoofing apps that can be used to make it look like you're calling from somewhere else or that you're using a different number. I could, if I knew the phone number of, one of your parents, I could call you and make it look like it's coming from them. And then you're more likely to answer, but then it would be me on the other line, or I could make it look like it's your work or your boss or your school or one of your other friends. And then you wouldn't be able to prove who the call actually came from because your phone records would show you got a phone call from your parents. And then my phone records wouldn't show I called you. Mine would show that I called some obscure number that then transferred me to you. So it makes it really difficult with all the advances in technology to not only avoid it, but also to prove what's happening. There's just so many different tools that they can use to hide it, that it makes it really hard. One of the things that I talked about a lot is this, behind the keyboard thing. For a case to really move forward, especially a cyber case, you have to be able to prove that it was that person. And that's very, very difficult to do in cyber cases. In terms of what I found for, the percentages, what was actually interesting was the highest number I found was actually for what I consider to be a combination. So it was a combination of cyber tactics and in-person tactics. So they might be calling and texting, but then they were also showing up at your job. So it was like usually a combination of both. And then the second highest was cyber, and the lowest was solely face-to-face. Hardly anyone was just doing the face-to-face, and usually those were strangers because they didn't have any way of contacting you through technology.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. I think just like with anything, social media apps, they're tools, and they can be used for, good things, and they can be used for bad things, obviously. And it makes it seem like it's kind of made it more difficult for the survivor, it sounds like, and also made it easier for the stalker in a way.
Absolutely, because there's so many tools to use that, if I block you on Facebook, you can then find me on Instagram or Twitter or something else. I'd have to completely disconnect from basically all electronics if I wanted to avoid you. I could block your phone number and then you could spoof me using a different one and it would go through. I could block your email and then you could make a new email account and it would come through. It's almost impossible to escape it if somebody really wants to. And I also saw, I hadn't put Craigslist as one of the things that I was tracking because I didn't expect it to come up as much as it did. But there was a lot of cases where people were using Craigslist to dox people. So they were posting their pictures or their phone numbers or their addresses, and they were saying, this person's looking for a good time, contact them, and kind of using these third parties to reach out on their behalf. And then it's almost impossible because they're not the ones doing the stalking. It's these other random people who are, communicating. So it makes it so much more difficult because there's so many different tools and avenues that people can use to torment somebody.
Wow. And it reminds me again of like what Orialis was saying earlier, the impacts that stalking can have. I was just thinking, the physical impacts of, they could be anywhere at your house, but then having to change all your social media accounts. You're being harassed in so many different ways on so many different platforms. That's really overwhelming. You can't escape it, like you were saying, Trisha. So
Well, it sounds like it can very easily just start to completely take over your life, because there's so many different things that now you have to be monitoring and changing, and you just have to be alert at all times because they're so focused on it.
Absolutely. Some of the research that I saw was saying that fear wasn't even the biggest thing that was coming out of some of these cases. The biggest thing that the victims were feeling was they felt like they were going crazy because they just couldn't escape it. So if the person was, far away, they weren't necessarily afraid that they were going to show up, but they just felt like they were losing their minds because they could not escape it. They had no way to turn it off.
Yeah, and with that, I actually wanted to throw it back at you, Orialis, because research has shown that victims are more likely to be stalked by someone they know. Could you talk a little bit about the emotional impacts of being stalked by someone you know, maybe a past partner or a current partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, no matter who the perpetrator is, there's going to be that sense of, the exhaustion, the stress, the fear, and all of those things. I think it can get trickier, more complicated when it is somebody that, you were in a relationship with, or, maybe someone who at the beginning, right, they seemed great. They seemed like somebody that you could trust, and, it's somebody that you love and trust. And typically we're not expecting those people to be the people that hurt us. Typically we may expect it to be somebody who is a stranger. However, we know, just like you said, the majority of the people perpetrating this are someone that the victim knows. I think some of the things that, stand out to me would be, really experiencing a sense of betrayal. Because again, at the beginning, it may not have started this way. The individual likely seemed really kind and seemed, really great. And then eventually, the actions may have changed. So just finding it difficult to trust others, right? Because you felt at the beginning, you thought that you could trust that person. So, you had no idea they were capable of this. And that's going to have implications for any future relationships and maybe even questioning some of the relationships that you already have. I also sometimes see, with folks of having like a loss of trust in themselves, of, feeling like you can't protect yourself or questioning yourself. Like, did I miss certain signs? Or, really just, I think when it's somebody that, again, somebody that we love, we tend to internalize it more. I think because it's difficult to conceptualize that somebody who we were in a relationship with could do something like that. And that just may look like, survivors may be questioning themselves, blaming themselves, feeling like they're responsible, for what they're going through. Maybe thinking that something they did is what led to this, or, what could they have done sooner to kind of prevent this from happening. And again, not to say that, folks, when it's a stranger, that they may not be experiencing trust or, difficulty with trusting others and things like that. But I think it can just be magnified. And additionally, I think, there can be an added level of fear, because if it is someone that you've been dating or you were in a relationship with, I mean, they likely have a lot of private information about you. They know where you frequent, they know your family, they may know your passwords, and that can lead to them having more leverage. So I think there can be, again, just some of these things can be magnified when it's someone that, again, you thought that you could trust at the beginning.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing all that. I totally see what you're saying, especially that vulnerability when you're in a relationship with someone and then, like a lot of relationships, they end, or maybe it's still happening and then you're starting to see those stalking red flags or experiencing stalking. I think that it does make it a little more complicated. Definitely. Trisha, I wanted to ask you, what characteristics and traits do you think are exhibited by stalkers that maybe people can look out for?
It's hard because, like Orialis was talking about, and like you mentioned before, the majority of stalkers are somebody that you were in a relationship with at some point, or that you currently are in a relationship with. So recognizing some of those red flags that we talk about with the power and control, like we were talking about at the beginning, we see a lot of things that might pop up and we might think, wow, that's really romantic. They care, or they care about my safety. They want to know where I am. They're checking in all the time, doing all of those things. But really, it could just be a means of keeping track of you and, wanting to know exactly what you're doing so that they can have that control. So I think if it's potentially a former partner, thinking about those red flags that you saw in the relationship, were they somebody who needed to know where you were all the time? Did they have access to phone or to different accounts, or know exactly where you might frequent? Because then it's more likely that, when you break up, they'll know exactly how to get in touch with you and they'll know how to kind of continue those behaviors. It's hard to predict when it's somebody that you don't know very well. If it's like a friend or an acquaintance or just somebody that you've met occasionally, it's hard to kind of see that they'd be capable of those sort of things because you don't always know them very well. And so that makes it a lot more difficult. It's easier to predict if it's, somebody that you are in a relationship with, because usually you've known them long enough where you can recognize some of those red flags and know to keep an eye out for them.
Absolutely. Orialis, I wanted to ask you, how can the VSC help support someone who has experienced stalking? And how can the VSC help support someone who is currently being stalked as well?
Yeah, well, we, for folks who are currently experiencing this, we do have our crisis counseling and our victim advocacy department. An individual can call and meet with an advocate, and really we'll kind of help them, walk through it. I mean, first of all, people may have never had any, prior encounters with the criminal justice system. And, like we've mentioned, it can be a long process from reporting, until, the end of the process. So The victim advocate can sit down with you, can help you create a safety plan. We can go over, what are the different red flags. We can, discuss different tips with you, even making you aware, like Trisha was talking about of the different spoofing apps and, about checking for spyware on your phone or, tracking apps on your phones that may be running in the background, just making you aware of all of those different things. Understandably, folks can be really scared or really nervous to report, these things to the police, or again, they may feel that maybe they don't have enough evidence, to go to the police or that they won't be believed. So, we'll be there to kind of help them, just discuss their options regarding reporting, helping them if, we need to educate them on how to log, all the different incidences that are happening. We can also we can go with you to make the report if you're feeling hesitant about that process. And throughout the whole criminal justice process, if you want to petition for a restraining order or if you need to go to trial, we can be right there with you and accompany you during that process. Additionally, if they are planning to move, we can always help them apply for the address confidentiality program. And then we also have our long-term therapy department for those folks that, again, just because the stalking has passed, and time has passed, they may still be experiencing those emotional tolls. And so for the folks who are recovering, and want to pursue counseling, we have our long-term therapy department. And it's also important to mention, all the services are free as well.
Yeah, always important to, mention that, yes, the VSC, all services for survivors and victims are completely free. And we do have that 24/7 helpline. So all of those things that Orialis mentioned absolutely are available for those that need it. And they can call that 24/7 helpline anytime. And someone like Orialis will be on the other line talking with you and there to support you no matter what. At any time. So thank you, Orialis. Trisha, I wanted to ask you, we talked a little bit about those like apps that you were talking about earlier. So what's the best way for people to protect themselves from stalking? For example, ways to block tracking apps, that kind of thing.
There's so many different ways, and Orialis mentioned so many of them already. Having somebody take a look and see if there's those apps on your phone, or getting a restraining order, or applying for the address confidentiality program. These are huge, and they're definitely ways that can really protect somebody from, being found if they don't want to be. In terms of the apps, like I said, they kind of, for the most part, run in the background. So you can't really look at your phone and be able to see it, but there might be some characteristics that will show up that might kind of alert you that something's happening. So if your phone starts to, suddenly starts to die really fast, it's just not holding its charge, that can be an indicator. Or if suddenly your data usage goes up really high, these are indicators, because what's happening is that your phone is constantly sending data to the other person through the use of the app. So depending on the type of app, some of them will send just location information, but some will go as far as to send keystroke data. So that means that anytime that you're typing something on your phone, that data is being sent to the other person. And so it can cause your phone to not hold its battery power or to use a lot of data. So taking your phone into the carrier, if you think that it might have an app on it, is a good way to be able to check, because what they can do is plug your phone in and be able to see any of the apps that are running in the background, and they'd be able to help with deleting it. Of course, when considering deleting it, it's really important to kind of think about the safety aspects of that. If somebody has that power of knowing exactly what you're doing at all times, what's the potential of what could happen if suddenly that power is cut off? If they don't have that access anymore, could they escalate their behavior? So it would be worth, speaking with an advocate and developing a safety plan to kind of figure out, okay, once I have this app deleted, how do I stay safe? Because I don't want this behavior to escalate. There's also an app program called Trap Call. So if, say, for example, I start calling you and I'm not using a spoofing app, but I'm just, blocking it. I'm just using *67 to block my number whenever I call. What Trap Call does is it actually unblocks that. So my phone might ring and it'll show blocked, and then I reject the call and it immediately calls me back with an unblocked number and it shows me who it is. I've known about this app for a while, but I was actually shocked that one of my reports, somebody used it and it worked, and they were able to prove that it was that person that was calling them because they were able to unblock it. It was really, really interesting.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then for spoofing, like I said, it's really hard to prove that, but something you can do. So say, you're getting a call and it's coming from, your sister, and it's not your sister when you answer. So you could pull your phone records, and your phone records would show that you got a call from your sister. But then if your sister pulled her phone records, it would show that she didn't make that call. And so it's a way to kind of just track that consistency that like this wasn't actually her making the call, somebody else did it using that phone number. And then just documentation. Documenting things is really huge in these cases. So writing down, different calls or messages that you got, what medium was used, what the date and time were, what the context was, but then also including how did it make you feel in that moment? Were you scared? Were you frustrated? Like, how did it make you feel? Because showing law enforcement or prosecutors that pattern of fear, it can be really important in these cases. So just kind of documenting everything can really help show that there's a pattern of behavior that's been going on for a long time that needs to be taken seriously.
Perfect. Yeah, all great points and really great information. Thank you so much for all the work that you both do. Orialis, I wanted, whenever I talk about different topics, in my trainings and stuff like that, I always like to think about myths that we want to debunk. And even though I feel like as a society, we don't talk about stalking enough, I just wanted to see if there's any misconceptions to stalking that you'd like to address.
Yeah, I actually think we've kind of addressed some of them, just throughout our, naturally throughout our conversation. But I do have some of them I've identified, and definitely, Trisha, feel free to jump in if there's anything else that, you can think of. But, I think the first one is, people think that this is something that only happens to like celebrities or famous people. In actuality, just like we've talked about, I believe it's about 3 in 4 people actually know the stalker. And, many times, again, it's like it can be an intimate partner or somebody, that you dated in the past. And really, it can be acquaintances, it could be a colleague, an ex-colleague, a neighbor, a stranger. So, anyone can be the victim of of stalking. So it's just really important that we don't make those assumptions. I think another one is, usually when we think of stalking, I think the image that for a lot of us comes to mind is of a male stalker and a female victim. So I tried to look up some numbers, and what I was able to find was from the 2015 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And the statistic that they say is that approximately 1 in 6 women, so it's like 16%, and about 1 in 17 men experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. So again, this can happen to anyone. And from the Office of Victims of Crime in 2018, of the women who reported stalking, 85% were stalked by a male. And of the men who reported stalking, 46% were stalked by a female and 43% were stalked by a male. So again, just, anyone can be the victim of stalking, and really anybody can be, a perpetrator as well. I think something that we've kind of already touched on is that a misconception that, stalkers are tech geniuses, and in all actuality, there are lots of free, low-cost apps, that stalkers can use for spoofing, for blocking their numbers, for using fake numbers, for spamming. And again, those apps that, spyware that can be put, on people's phones. And unfortunately, people can find pretty easily, how-tos on how to do these things online. Another one is that, if it isn't malicious or if it isn't physically threatening, then it isn't really stalking or it isn't really harmful, and again, not all stalkers threaten or physically hurt the victim. And a lot of times, we can tend to overlook these behaviors because they're not openly malicious. However, we really shouldn't be ignoring any sign because, again, it's the emotional toll. It's so important, to really focus on, okay, how is it making you feel? How is this pattern of behavior making you feel? And unfortunately, we know that, there is a strong link between stalking and other forms of violence as well, and intimate partner violence. I think another one might be that it's not stalking if it's in a relationship. So, again, we may assume that it would only be a stranger. And, like we've mentioned, a lot of the behaviors that form that pattern of behavior of stalking in a relationship are methods for, controlling a person, such as keeping tabs. So, it is really important if you're in a relationship and you're experiencing this, really encouraging you to seek support from your local domestic violence center. I think this is an important one to kind of discuss too, that if you ignore a stalker, they're going to stop stalking you, like it's going to go away on its own. And sometimes that may happen, if you ignore them, it may stop on its own, but it may also continue. I think a lot of times when something makes us anxious, we kind of want to ignore it, and we may want to hope, that it's going to go away on its own. And we do recommend that you cease contact with the stalker. But, we also really recommend that you let people know what's happening, reach out to a victim advocate. Like Trisha was saying, these cases can be really difficult to prosecute because of not having enough evidence. And so, really starting a stalking log every time that something happens, what happened, what was it, what was the time and date, how did it make you feel? And reaching out, out to people. I think one that it's kind of, it made me, I was thinking of the Netflix series, like You. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but sometimes, these things can be, again, at the beginning, it can be romanticized, So with You, if, listeners have watched that series, Joe, who's the main person, some people watch the show and they think that Joe is this like romantic, protective, attractive person, very loyal. And then in actuality, when we actually listen to the things that he's saying and when we listen to his internal dialogue in the show, we actually see that he's very possessive, he's obsessive, he's controlling, he's manipulative. So again, stalking is about having power and control over somebody. It's not about the stalker's, love for the person. It's not flattering, it's scary, and it's dangerous. So just above all, always listening to your gut feelings. I think those are the things that I thought about. I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts.
You just brought up such a great point. When I was thinking about You, and I'd seen the series, one of the things I was thinking about was how, when Joe when you hear his internal dialogue, he doesn't consider himself to be a bad guy. He thinks that he is doing these things because he just loves this person so much, or that he cares for them and wants to protect them and wants to make sure that, they're okay. And so to him, he doesn't feel like he's tormenting people or causing them any sort of harm. He feels like he's doing something good. And so I think that there's sometimes this perception that stalkers are, inherently terrible people who just really want to torment somebody. And I think, of course, there are people that are like that. But I think in some ways, there's a lot of people who don't necessarily realize that the behaviors that they're doing impact other people negatively. And so I think, even in our own lives, it's important to kind of look at, our behaviors and how we could potentially be impacting somebody else. Do we love somebody so much that we could potentially be causing them harm because we're doing things that might be causing them to feel anxious or scared when we think that we're doing it for a good reason. So even looking kind of inside at our own behaviors can be really important too.
Right. And even just like, I think it's so hard. We can't go to that person and expect that they're going to see what they're, like if we try to confront the person, they may not even understand, or they think that what they're doing is totally fine. And so it is so important to be thinking about, okay, but what are my feelings, right? Like, how am I reacting to this? Am I scared? Is this crossing my boundaries? Versus trying to confront and looking for that validation, from that individual.
When we do our healthy relationships training, we talk a lot about, boundaries. Again, another word that keeps coming up when I'm thinking of this podcast. And yeah, a lot of it is kind of stepping back and saying, oh, maybe I am doing that. Maybe I am crossing some boundaries, doing that introspection. That's really important. So yeah, great points. Trisha, I wanted to ask you, in your research, how has stalking and cyberstalking developed over the past 3 years? Did you see any differences between those three counties that you were looking at? And did you see any general trends at all?
Yeah, so in terms of the counties, what a couple things I found that were interesting was that in Orange and Seminole County, the majority of the cases were either were a combination of cases. So they were the ones that included both cyber aspects and in-person aspects. But Brevard County, the vast majority of theirs were cyber only. And so it made me think, well, what's different kind of about that county? And the only thing I could really think of is looking at the county itself and seeing, it's a really long county. So there's always the chance that maybe they just live too far away from the other person to actually show up in person. So that was really interesting. But then when I also looked at the arrest rates, the trial rates, and the guilty verdict rates, Brevard County had a significantly higher rate of arrest than Orange and Seminole counties. And they also had a significantly higher rate of going to trial. So not only were their officers making more arrests in these cases, but then the cases were actually going all the way through the criminal justice system more often than the other counties. And I'm not fully sure why, but what was also interesting was that in Brevard County, for the stalking cases that went all the way through the criminal justice system, 100% of them were found guilty. So they really only went for the ones that they could kind of go all the way for, but they also had the highest arrest rates. So there's something about their system, and they might have, a specialized, unit that really does a great job of investigating these cases, or prosecutors that know a lot about the technology that's being used or the impact it's having on victims. But there's something about their system over there that's showing that they have more arrests and they're taking it a little bit more seriously, but also they're having a lot of success in the criminal justice system. In terms of how it's changed, I think the biggest thing is just the ever-changing technology. It's constantly being updated. I'm always learning about new things every single day, pretty much. I was just shown yesterday something on Twitter called like a list. So say, for example, if you're on Twitter and you just start getting spammed with hateful messages from different people. Maybe you've posted something in the past that's a little controversial. You can actually see if you're on some sort of list that might target people that have certain viewpoints. And there's just this constant change in technology that we just can't really keep up with. So if we can't keep up with it, how is law enforcement supposed to keep up with it? And how are they supposed to continuously be getting trained on all of these changes where apps are made every single day? For every app that pops up, that means you have to be trained to address it. And it's just constant stream. One of the apps that I had kind of used to be able to show people what spoofing is like, the same company actually created another app to block robocalls, which I thought was really funny because I'm like, you create the app that allows these calls to come through, but then you also create the app that blocks them. And it's just really interesting to see the constant progression of things and how technology continues to evolve. And I think we're going to continue to see less and less of the solely face-to-face stalking cases because of the fact that we have all of this technology available to us. We've seen potential apps coming out where you see somebody that you're interested in and you can scan their face and it'll pop up with their social media and things. From what I know, they haven't actually been launched yet, but I know that there are some of those that are, in the works. And so it makes it so that even if it's a stranger, I can then find you on social media and I can try to connect with you in what seems like a normal way, but really it's because I saw you out and about and I wanted to get to know you and couldn't just go up to you in person.
Wow. That all just sounds so overwhelming for a lot of reasons, just the constant changing. And that's definitely an alarming thought of that new app that you're talking about. Orialis, I wanted to check with you, do you have any advice you would like to share for survivors of stalking, as a victim advocate, or any crime as it comes to the process of healing?
Yeah, I feel as if I say these things all the time, but I also feel like I can't say them enough. Like I've mentioned throughout, just trust your gut. If something is making you uncomfortable, or if you're communicating a boundary and, that person is continuing to overstep it, I just really encourage you to reach out. Going through something like this is a very isolating experience. A lot of times, again, we feel like there's no hope, there's no way out, or we're the only person going through this. And I really, really encourage you to tell people, to create a support system for yourself. You really don't have to go through it alone. And I think the other thing that's really important that I can't say enough is, it's not your fault. You're not responsible for what you're going through, for what's happening to you. The only person responsible is the perpetrator. They are the ones choosing to hurt you. And ultimately, that's the only reason that this is happening. So I encourage you to reach out. I recognize it's difficult to really face these things. But again, the sooner that you start to talk about it, that's the sooner that you can get that control back and you can start to, reclaim your life.
Yeah, always a fantastic reminder that it definitely is not your fault if you're, going through something like stalking. I know we're talking a lot about, the apps and ways to protect yourself, but at the end of the day, it's still, no matter what, definitely not your fault. And actually, with that, I wanted to ask you, Trisha, with the research that you have done, do you have any advice you'd like to share in general to the audience?
Yeah, so one of the interesting findings that I found in my research was there was a significant higher rate of arrest in cases where the victim had taken some sort of proactive action. So I looked at a couple different things for that. So whether it was the victim telling the other person to stop, whether it was them attempting to block them on certain mediums, whether it was trying to get a restraining order or a previous report to law enforcement, those sort of things seemed to show that there was that level of fear. And so I think that by doing some of those things, it really helped to show law enforcement that the victim themselves was feeling fear, that they had made some sort of attempts to stop the behavior, but that their actions didn't prevent it and that they continued afterwards. So my suggestion would be whether it's deciding to take one of those actions, if somebody has gone to law enforcement and it hasn't gone anywhere, I'd suggest not giving up. If you feel like going through the criminal justice system is the best option for you, um, if you go back, there's always a chance that they'll take it more seriously because you've already taken some sort of action. And like I said, they considered it to be an action, even if it's just saying, leave me alone, I don't want to talk to you, or just trying to block them. Any attempts to try to shut down that behavior and then for the person to continue it really seemed to make a big impact with the system. So that would be my advice, is to try to take some sort of action, whatever you feel the most comfortable with, of course, given the circumstances, and just let them know, I tried my best and it didn't make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for doing all that research. I'm sure it was a labor of love for sure. You were
It
probably
definitely
working
was.
yeah, 888. Wow. I just can't believe it. So, yeah, I'm really glad that we have this space to be able to share that with anyone listening, because I think that's really good information to have. Orialis, as a final question to you, I wanted to ask, how could someone support a loved one or a friend who is or has been a victim of stalking?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're, someone who wants to be able to support someone, first of all, just, asking yourself the type of person that you are, right? Because you can offer emotional support, but you can also offer like tangible, physical support. So I think on the emotional side, encouraging the person, really reminding them that you believe them, that you take them seriously. Again, validating them, reminding them it's not their fault. You can always look up some research or some red flags on their behalf because, again, they may be feeling like they're going crazy or, they may not be sure, that stalking is actually what they're experiencing. Um, Again, you may not be able to take that pain away from them, but it just being a listening ear sometimes and being able to let them know, like, I'm right here with you. I'm just here to listen and support you. Sometimes that can go a long way. I also think really, again, encouraging them to seek help, to reach out to an advocate. Being a physical support, could even look like going with them to the police station. I really like when I'm working on the helpline and loved ones call the helpline on behalf of someone to ask about our services, to ask what the intake process looks like so that they can, let their friend or their family member know so they can feel a little bit more comfortable when they call us and know what to expect. You can even, go with them to their service provider if they need to check their phone. So, any of those physical things too. A lot of times, when folks are dealing with the criminal justice system or dealing with all of this, they may have to miss a lot of work, or so even anything like offering to make them a meal or offering to, watch their kids while they have to go to court or anything like that. So there's a lot of different ways, that you can be supportive. So really asking yourself what kind of person you are and, just believing them and validating them throughout it.
Definitely. Love all of that. And it's also important to reiterate as well that the Victim Service Center does help support secondary survivors of trauma too. So again, if you're a loved one of someone who's going through some traumatic event or has been, and you feel affected by that, of course, absolutely you can call our 24/7 helpline as well, and we're here and able to offer those free services to you as well as a supporter. And as a final question to you, Trisha, what can someone's Title IX office do to help support a student who is experiencing stalking on campus?
Yeah, so I'm going to put a disclaimer here that the Title IX regulations have changed recently. And so as of August 14th, some of the things are going to change a little bit. So we're still putting all of that into place. So what I'm going to talk about is really related to how we would handle it in the moment right now. So like I said before, if somebody is experiencing stalking on campus and the other person is affiliated, then what can happen is if it gets reported to us, we might proceed to an investigation. If that's what they're looking for, we try to default to the request of the person reporting, as long as it's not some immediate threat to safety to the campus community. Those are the only situations where we would, do an investigation without the person complaining, wanting us to. But if they do want us to kind of proceed to an investigation, what can happen is we could do the no contact order. And so the no contact order on our campus is a little different than the ones in the criminal justice system, of course, because a violation of a no contact order through the school means that it would go through the student code of conduct process. So instead of, somebody being arrested for violating a no contact order, what might happen is they get a suspension or a warning, or worst case scenario, an expulsion. Same kind of outcome if there's an investigation and somebody's found to have violated our policy and to have stalked somebody else. That also kind of goes through the conduct process at this point, where they make the determination of what happens. I would say the majority of the cases that we've seen that had somebody that was stalking somebody else on campus did typically result in at least a suspension, so that person usually wasn't able to be part of the campus community for the time period that the person that was reporting was. So at the very least, they're not on campus together. And that no contact order, of course, continues. But if somebody doesn't want to go through the full investigation process, we can also help them in other ways. So it might just be, I don't want to have class with this person anymore. And without going through an investigation, we can very easily move the person who's reporting to another class to something, that's usually the same mode, sometimes even the same faculty member. We've been lucky enough to do that sometimes. Or if they are just going through a lot right now and they're not able to be successful in their courses, we've been able to also have their courses drop so that they can take it again at a later time, usually without any sort of cost, because that's really important for them to not be penalized for going through something that's really traumatic. So people can work with our office without having to go through the full investigation process, because I know that can be really taxing. Like I said, some of it's going to change a bit, but our level of support is always going to be there. We always want to be there for somebody who is, reporting these sorts of behaviors. We want to make sure that everyone feels safe on campus. That's kind of our number one priority. Is we just want people to feel like they can come to the campus or be in classes online or in person, and that they're going to be treated fairly and that they're going to feel safe.
Yeah, that is really important to mention, that there are changes that are going to be coming up. And actually, we will be having a podcast just all about that. We'll be sitting down with people from Valencia, from the Title IX office as well, to discuss more about that. But like Trisha was mentioning, that doesn't mean that the Title IX office can't keep supporting students. Definitely. Thank you so much, Trisha and Orialis, for sharing all that you did today. It was really educational for me. I hope it was educational for the listener as well. Did either of you have anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation, just as a final sign off here?
I just wanted to kind of reiterate something that Orialis was saying when we were kind of talking about some of the misconceptions that we have. It's very similar to sexual assault in the way that it's not usually the stranger hiding in the bushes, jumping out and attacking you. It's often somebody that in some capacity. So knowing that might help you to be able to kind of look out for those red flags and kind of see, what could be going on and recognize some of those behaviors, before it gets too bad. But also, like you both mentioned, it's not your fault. If this is something that's happening to you, you didn't do anything to cause this. There's nothing that you did that, told somebody it's okay to treat me this way. So just know that it's not your fault, and that everyone is, Title IX office, VSC is here to support you if you're going through it.
Yeah, I think for me, just again reiterating, just trust your gut, and if your boundaries are being crossed, if you feel anxious around this person, trust your gut. That's all the justification you need for wanting to end that relationship. And I think that's why it's so important to reach out and just tell a friend, reach out, call the helpline if you're unsure, like, is this stalking or not? Call the helpline. A victim advocate will help you identify, some of the red flags. Again, sometimes it can be difficult when it was somebody you were in a relationship with, or just when you're in the situation, it's kind of difficult to step out and, see the pattern. And so always just having an objective kind of third person, can really can go a long way. So really just trust your gut and reach out to someone.
Definitely. And yeah, I'd like to also reiterate, just as Trisha and Orialis were saying, there is hope. You're not alone. There's people here definitely ready to support you and help you through the process of healing. But with that, I think that's a great place to sign off. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you, Trisha and Orialis, so much for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.